chance. Sumera Saleem, please go ahead. Unmute yourself and ask the question, please.
Right. I hope you can hear me. Thank you so much.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much for arranging such a wonderful seminar. And basically, I was interested and looking forward to the discussion.
Could you introduce yourself a bit?
Actually,
we'd like.
Is my voice audible?
No, you're audible, yes.
Right. Actually, there are two questions that I want to ask with a brief comment. First one is to Dr. Mustafa. The way he mentioned about that we need to exercise patience and we need to have a kind of very flexible mindset in order to tolerate differing viewpoints and arguments which come from the people who belong to another religion. I think he's very right in pointing out that type of flexibility. But my question is, do you think that it's not just on individual level that we are having this issue across the world, because it's not just an individualistic mindset that can be molded in order to achieve a kind of very multicultural environment where people can share their ideas. There is also a very political background attached to that, in which the state has to play a role, in which the key players, state key players and non-state key players do have a share to contribute in order to, if a person is taking law in his hands, it also conveys a message that he's not relying on judicial system to which he can complain about the person who has hurt his religious sensibility. And there is another question to Dr. Ahmed, actually you try to present your arguments, but I don't think they are valid enough, because I don't know if you are actually looking at the condition in Pakistan from an external viewpoint, or you have been the part of the society here. I'm sorry for that, because sometimes being and having an external viewpoint does come with a kind of perception that is not valid enough. So putting together the causes behind radicalization in Muslim society, and identifying three sections of society, for example, Islamist and Sufi players. I don't think this is the this kind of categorization is applicable to the way we see the kind of radicalization, the spread of radicalization in Muslim society. And you have mentioned that freedom of expression is not here, and Muslims here, the scholars and intellectuals are oppressors, are being oppressed. So who is actually oppressing them? Is it the government? Or it is something else, right? Because I don't think there are many scholars who are being oppressed, and there are so many dynamics involved. So many intellectuals and scholars have been invited to international forums, and they have joined international universities, and we are proud of them. Since they are not part of our landscape right now, since they are not in our country, it doesn't mean that they are cut off from the society and the Muslim world is just backward intellectually and economically or socially or morally.
Okay, I think we got your point.
My question is freedom of, what is your idea of freedom of expression? Because you are mentioning that there isn't any freedom of expression. Thank you so much.
I think that's for Ahmet and Akyol.
Should I begin first or Ahmed?
She mentioned you first, Akyol. Maybe you can go ahead.
Well, I mean, thank you so much, Sumera, for the question. You emphasized the political aspect of it. Of course, it's political. I mean, there are individual Muslims who want to silence blasphemy on a personal level, but then there are states. And actually emphasizing the state dimension is important, because which allows us to question, where did these apostasy really laws come from, and what did they serve in history? I mean, Ahmed mentioned Ibn Sina, thrown takfir on him, in the final page of Imam Ghazali's book on the philosophers. His name wasn't mentioned, but the philosophers. So this was, I will tell something even before that. one of the first people executed in Islam for blasphemy or apostasy, and they were conflated at the time, was Gailan al-Dimashqi, which was a scholar who criticized the Umayyad Sultanate, Umayyad Caliphate for being tyrants. He was not an apostate. He was not a blasphemer. He was a defender of free will against predestinarianism. And he was killed for denying the qadar of Allah, which is, you know, the written predestination. He was a political critic of the regime, and he was depicted as a blasphemer, and he was killed for that. So today we should understand that, yes, there are individual Muslim inclinations towards silencing blasphemy, and there is a political surfing on that. You know, some political leaders come out and as defenders of Islam by silencing the blasphemers. And let's not forget that those blasphemers sometimes include fellow Muslims just with different persuasions. I mean, in Pakistan, Shia Muslims are targeted for blasphemy against the Sahaba, right? Ahmadis, you know, are very much often demonized and otherized, and also have been attacked as well. So there is a political, and that political aspect serves somebody, right? It doesn't necessarily serve our prophet, who doesn't need any protection, but it serves somebody who is holding power. In Malaysia, for example, an example that comes to my mind, Prime Minister Najib Razak was a big defender of, you know, punishing any insult to Islam, and he was a big enemy of liberalism, and he was condemning liberalism in every speech. He said, you know, West is trying to lead us astray by these liberal ideas. He was the man who stole $1 billion, I mean, from public funds. And it was not that, you know, he was not a very Salafi guy or anything. I mean, he was a corrupt politician who is in jail now.
He was very liberal with the public treasury.
I mean, he had villas in Miami,
Not with Islam.
State funds, but he was lecturing Muslims on the evils of liberalism. I mean, probably liberalism was bad for him, because liberalism includes you should be able to criticize those in power as well. I mean, I think we should understand that a lot of power dynamics are in this whole history of Islam. And we owe a lot of oppressive laws to the Umayyad or Abbasid caliphs or other sultans, and who didn't want to be criticized, or who wanted to uphold themselves as the leader of faith. One more thing is that we Muslims should think on this thing called free expression. I mean, Westerners are always championing freedom of expression, and we're saying freedom of expression doesn't allow insult and so on and so forth. I make a distinction between an honest critique versus an ugly insult. Yes, these are different things. They are not on the same level more. But do we believe in something called freedom of expression? And why is it important that people speak their minds? And now, if you think whole truth is coming from one imam or one scholar, and that's all you need, you don't need freedom of expression. You just need to hear the right person, right? And his voice should be heard, and that should be the establishment. But if you accept that truth is not that clear, right? Who knows the truth exactly isn't that clear. So we need a conversation about truth, different argumentations about truth, so you can go, so you understand the value of freedom of expression. In Ottoman tradition, I mean, me and Ahmet are, you know, let's say post-Ottomans, we are Turkish. There has been a great interest in free expression by the Tanzimat intellectuals like Namık Kemal, who was an Islamic liberal. And he has this famous verse, I mean, the light of truth comes from the clash of ideas. So if I have one idea and the other one is another idea, how do we understand which one is the right one? Well, we can have a competition between them. That's why it is important. But if you want to silence one idea and call it blasphemy, and this one is a truth one, you end the discussion. And that's why freedom of expression is important to unravel all the authoritarian structures in thought. And that is really important. And Ahmet books has shown how losing freedom of expression in the Muslim world led to stagnation, and that had economic and political consequences.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Ahmed,
Very
perhaps you can.
briefly, yeah. Thanks, Mustafa, and we are all looking forward to your book too. And thanks for the question. I just want to clarify very briefly from historical and contemporary perspective. What I meant by intellectual stagnation was referring to a long-term problem, which was perfectly reflected on the fact that although Muslims were very early in producing paper from 8th century, learning Chinese, then teaching to Europeans, Europeans late to receive 5th century later. Muslims later on became very indifferent to intellectual life, and they got the first Muslim printing press 287 years after Gutenberg. For 3 centuries, no printing press anywhere in the Muslim world. Can you imagine today a region in the world without internet for a very long time? So that was the problem. And what's the result? The result, early 1800, the average literacy rate in the Ottoman Empire, 1%, whereas it was 31% in Western Europe. In the entire 1800, the number of books printed in the Ottoman printing presses, 50,000, which was in Europe, 1 billion. 1 billion versus 50,000. So that's the historical gap because of the ulama-state alliance, because of the lack of freedom of doing research and lack of motivation and focusing on state and state ulama alliance and military adventures of Ottomans and Safavis and Mughals. Today, contemporary era, how do I know the Islamist Sufis and the ulama supported wrong way? Because when we look at the funeral of the murderer of the governor of Punjab, Faizur mentioned in his introduction in Pakistan, we see the Sufi tariqas, we see the ulama, we see the Islamists declaring the murderer as hero because of he was killing the governor of Punjab because of the blasphemy. And let me give you a more recent example. Atif Mian, a very important economist at Princeton, a friend of mine, he was supposed to give a webinar seminar in Pakistan. It was cancelled with the idea that he is an Ahmadi and his religious views are not acceptable. And this is one of the best economists in the world from Pakistan. And he wants to teach something, economics in Pakistan through webinar from Princeton University. But it was cancelled in Pakistan for being an Ahmadi or for some excuses. And this is a problem that we need to deal with. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Anna. Before I go to the next question,
Faizur, Iftar Malik, Dr. Malik has a question. Keep raising his hand. I'm just letting you know.
Yes, I'll go to, before I go to the Ifat Malik, I think. I can see Al-Mawrid Institute here. If that is Javed Ahmad Ghamidi Saab, who is representing the institute by any chance, we would like him to say a few words, because as far as I know, Al-Mawrid Institute belongs to Javed Saab. And if he's here, I think we would like to give him an opportunity to say a few words. He's a prominent scholar. Can you hear me, the Al-Mawrid Institute?
Thank you so much. I'm sorry for it. Actually, here is Usman. I'm not representative of Al-Mawrid, and my device was used by Al-Mawrid. That's why it is ID was not logged out.
Okay, this is not Javed Ahmad Saab's ID. Okay,
yes,
so in that case, we will go to the next question now.
Yeah, if I can.
Yes, Afsar Saab, I think you had come after that. After you, Afsar Saab, Ifat Malik, you said, right? Ahmed, who was that you said? The next.
Yes, Iftar Malik.
Ifat Malik, I think he can go ahead after that. Yes, yes, Afsar Saab, please go ahead.
Yes. By the way, this is Afsar Ali from Chicago area, and my question is specifically directed to Professor Moosa, because I generally tend to agree with what Professor.
Can you come on your camera? No, you never.
Unfortunately, my camera is messed up.
Okay.
Unfortunately, my camera is messed up. I apologize. My apologies. Okay. Yeah, I generally agree with what Professor Kuru said, and generally with even Professor Akyol as well. But my question is specifically directed to Professor Moosa because of some of the statements he made. The provocateurs are going to be there. And in fact, there's an industry of Islamophobes, well-funded, literally to the tune of tens of millions of dollars per year. People making careers in the name of bashing Islam and Muslims and provoke Muslims into doing it. But the best way of, frustrating a provocateur is to not get provoked. And unfortunately, Muslims have made it a part of their religion to react to these provocateurs, unfortunately. And we need to question the basis for that. And the basis, unfortunately, you seem to have defended that basis. It literally comes out of the Hadith literature. The Quran, as Faiz Sahab has also mentioned, and other speakers have mentioned, there's no provision for going after these blasphemers or even apostates. He says, just let them go, be patient, sabr. That's all that it advocates. Why should we not start questioning the sources, extra Quranic sources? And that is the debate that we need to have. Because all of this, including what ISIS did, people who have written in the past, particularly Ibn Taymiyyah, very toxic stuff that he has written, all of that comes out of it's based in extra Quranic literature, assumptions that prophets said or did something. Unfortunately, people who were at the forefront of this movement to document hadith, the Ahl Hadith, going back to the debate of between Ahl Hadith and Ahl Rai, the rationalists versus anti-rationalists, there was a reason why they did not want it documented. The rationalists didn't want it documented. And the people who were at the forefront of that movement, like Ahmad ibn Hanbal and Imam Shafi, they were of the opinion that these extra Quranic sources do not rise to the level of certainty, yaqeen. They don't rise to the level of certainty unless they are mutawatir, multiple sources saying the same thing. And the tragedy is we go after these questionable zanni sources that are just conjectural and make absolute timeless laws out of it. And unless you go and attack that, you're not going to be able to speak out against ISIS. You're not going to be, or anybody who comes out with these, does these horrendous actions like what happened in the last week or 2 weeks. Why should we not attack those? Why should I consider what you said? Oh, it is authentic. This report is authentic. No, it is not. The people who gathered that material said it is zanni. You quoted Ahad reporting. Ahad reporting is zanni. Unless you attack that, and Quran says, don't go after zan. Don't go after zan. Alhamdulillah, religion is based on yaqeen, certainty. So I would like to.
I think you got the I think you got a point, Sir Sam.
Yeah, thank you.
Professor Moosa,
yeah, a couple of things. I think that one of the things that we need to do is to be honest with ourselves and also have a much more capacious understanding of what our tradition is. If I want to do a one-man ban of Islam and basically advocate that, there's this simple way that I can wave away all the issues and so on, I know how to do that, but I know I will not be credible. And so I think if you are going to say that there are no such laws in Islam and no such interpretations on Islam, and you're going to make all these arguments that these are dhanni, first of all, highly confusing. The last speaker, I didn't get the person's name, I know from Chicago. I don't want to get into the minutiae, but most interpretations in matters of faith are based on zanni. In other words, they are based on a certain kind of interpretation. Things that are categorical, yaqini, and so on. Categorical, there's a qat'i. The opposite of that is qat'i. These are epistemological sources and so on. So I don't want to get into those kind of details. So I think we can have a separate conversation about that. You can take my number. I can have a conversation with you about that. I don't want to distract you. The big issue here is that you need to be very clear that when you're going to talk to people among Muslims, you're going to find different Muslims have different kinds of epistemological and historical approaches to this stuff. If you're not going to go prepared to understand those issues, you're going to have zero conversation among Muslims themselves. Secondly, when you're going to deal with people on the outside, they know our tradition. They're going to confront you with this information. You can't just wave it away and say, these are dhanni. They're going to show you that the way you make your prayers, you raise your hands and all your rituals, all those things are based on dhanni interpretations. In other words, conjecture. When the Quran talks about conjecture, that means those are not based on certainty, but epistemologically, zanni works. All interpretations, 99% of interpretations are zanni. In other words, they're based on a certain on the preponderance of a certain amount of truth. So zanni interpretations epistemologically are fairly acceptable in all philosophical traditions. Not only, nowhere does one get certainty. Even to say H2O is certainty is a different kind of epistemology. It is an empirical forms of certainty, but all kinds of other kinds of certainty are of the order of zanni, number one. Number two, the provocateurs in the industry, they are there. I think you didn't get the questioner from Chicago might not have gotten my point. My point is that these issues that were based on hadith, whether you deem it to be unreliable or questionable, or others deem it to be reliable, these are interpretations that can be revisited. These are mujtahad fihi. These are questions that are subject to interpretive authority. Many verses of the Quran are also subject to interpretive authority. I also want to disagree with people who, for instance, all of Islam, the decline of all of Islam is based on Ghazali. That is not true. That is a very unreliable form of interpretation. How can a massive tradition and a complex tradition be overrun by a single person? Maybe that single person did have a certain kind of influence, but this very same Ghazali tells you in a very important text of his, he says, there is no salvation except in independence of thought. Forget all you've heard and clutch what you see. At sunrise, what use is Saturn to thee. If writing these words yields no other outcome save to make you doubt your inherited beliefs, compelling you to inquire, then it was worth it, leave alone profiting you. Doubt transports you to the truth. Who does not doubt fails to inquire. Who does not inquire fails to gain insight. Without insight, you remain blind and perplexed. So we seek God's protection from such an outcome. Ghazali asked you to think. Ghazali's fight with the theologians was on three points that he thought they left the general consensus. And unfortunately, he showed them the red card, which is the card of anathema. I think that is regrettable that he did that. He overmade his point, but he's mortal and he can make an error. And we don't necessarily have to follow him in that. And there are different kinds of interpretations. Shah Waliullah, on some of those points that Ghazali criticized the theologians, Shah Waliullah adopts that on the question about the eternity of the world. He just phrases it slightly differently. So I think these are issues that our intellectual tradition has been much more robust and much more complex. So the question is, these hadith issues and so on, there's a lot, this becomes an integral part. There are those who believe that the Quran only solution is the way out for Muslims. That is a point of view, but some people will disagree with you on that position. There will be disagreement. And if you want to have a comprehensive conversation, if you want to have a serious conversation, then you'll have to bring those people into the conversation who also understand that in a different way, and that conversation is necessary. Some things have been said about madrasa communities. Yes, indeed, some madrasa communities are extremely toxic, some madrasa communities. But you can't make that on all. And I think generalizing is going to be deeply problematic. The people who you want to have a conversation with, if you're going to alienate them, you're not going to have the conversation that's going to lead to the solution. Unless you think that people like me sitting in Notre Dame in the United States, we have the answers. I regret to inform you, we don't have the answers. Neither can we solve the problems in Pakistan or Turkey or other places. These are for people themselves. What we can contribute to is to insert a robust conversation. What we can do is help in creating what I would call, move people away from dangerous literacy to a literacy for civilization, from a dangerous literacy to an informed literacy. Oftentimes people, look, in many parts of the world, and I deal with madrasa communities for the last 5 years more intensely than before. My training is in madrasas and so on, is that people are angry. People are frustrated. The kind of things that Ahmed talked about, the lack of life opportunities, the lack of success, the lack of others going forward and Muslims behind, the fact that Muslims live in totalitarian states. These are issues that lead to deep frustration. And oftentimes the solution that people need to choose, that the Quran cannot solve all your problems. The Hadith cannot solve all your problems. But when you are powerless to that extent, then the Quran has to become your father, your mother, your God, everything else. It has to do all the work for you. In other words, issues that should be resolved, the questions of culture, and where culture, literacy, poetry solves your problem, where good governance solves your problems. Ahmed can speak about these issues in much better ways than me because that's his specialty. The question of having human dignity is not only provided by religion. Human dignity is about the roof over your head, the water that you drink, the health that you have. The absence of those things make you frustrated, and hence you have these very pathological interpretations of religion that are very, very much available in Muslim societies and deep in Muslim societies. And in fact, this is not only for those people who at a dime can be hired to come for a protest. This pathological interpretation is also amongst the middle classes and the upper middle classes. I have had conversations with people in Cairo and Karachi, in Cape Town and other parts, people who have 2 Mercedes-Benz standing outside their houses and they own it. And they will talk to you and say they support, executions of blasphemers. They will give you all kinds of toxic interpretations. Where do they get that from? They don't have, it's what I call the deficit of dignity. They have all the money in the world. They don't have dignity. And when they don't have dignity, they think power and anger will help them. But coming back to the big issues, this question that we have in front of us, we talked about the madrasas. These debates of moving people from that historical position where blasphemy requires insult to the Prophet requires execution, apostasy requires the death penalty, has to be dealt with in a conversation, an intra-Muslim conversation. And an intra-Muslim conversation means that we have to be open to listening to the others. So for instance, give you an example, in the early part of the 20th century, a leading Deobandi scholar, most of you might know that Deobandi is one of the major interpretations of Islam, in addition to Salafism and the Barelvi school of thought on the subcontinent, and they have a global franchise. A leading figure in that school, one of the first students, his name is Mahmoud al-Hassan. They call him Sheikh al-Hind. Mahmoud al-Hassan was the anti-colonial activist, leading anti-colonial activist, and also a major scholar of hadith at Deoband. He's asked in the class about insult to the Prophet and love for the Prophet. And I think this happens in the time in the subcontinent where a person, it is not linked directly, but you should know the atmosphere in the subcontinent, where someone wrote a book called Rangila Rasul. And that person who wrote the book, or the publisher, one of them were killed in many parts of the subcontinent today. That killer is deemed as a major hero. Someone's what's the name is mic is open. They should kindly
Usman
close it.
Basha's mic is open.
Then Mahmoud al-Hassan says, love for the Prophet. He said, think about it. He says, contempt shown to the Prophet, on whom be peace, unconsciously hides our own experience of that attempted scorn. In other words, when contempt is shown to the Prophet, unconsciously it hides our own experience of that attempted scorn. People are attempting to scorn the Prophet. Actually, he says, it is the collective ego and self-esteem of the Muslims that feel wounded. Yet, whom we regard as prophet and messenger is not someone you can possibly humiliate. Yet, whom we regard as prophet and messenger is not someone you can humiliate. It is the collective ego, we, that experiences the lash of contempt. To claim that love for the Prophet, on whom be peace, drives the desire to avenge such an offense is to only further a serious misunderstanding. Who's saying this? This is not a modern educated person saying this. This is Mahmoud al-Hassan. This is a Deobandi. This is a man who loves the hadith, who takes hadith extremely seriously. He can have the mindset to think. The absence of thinking is the major challenge to contemporary Muslims. What does Mahmoud al-Hassan say? To claim that love for the Prophet, on whom be peace, drives the desire to avenge such an offense is to only further a serious misunderstanding. Self-delusion is possibly the best description. He's saying those Muslims who are going after to avenge are engaged in self-delusion. Whoever contemplates this matter calmly will surely recognize their inconsistent conduct and will reach a similar conclusion to mine. Yet people will go on claiming that their actions please their beloved, irrespective of the consequences. In the meanwhile, the daily calls to prayers go unanswered, while the multitude indulge in futile and useless conversation and thus fail to hasten to the muazzin's invitation to pray. In all fairness, he says, how appropriate is the proclamation of love for the Prophet made by the mouths of such people? Okay, this is a very credible interpreter of the tradition. This man can move himself. Do you think he did not know that the rule is about execution of the blasphemer or the insulted? He didn't know. Why did he not? He comes to a different understanding to that in the beginning of the 20th century, because he's a thinking person. And that is the critical issues that we need to do, as the previous panelist has said, that we need to think about those issues in very comprehensive ways and not think that our interpretation is the only interpretation. There are multiple interpretations, and we equip ourselves to deal with a multitude of interpretations. Then we will be able to deal with this issue better. Otherwise, it becomes a point of view that does not necessarily yield a robust conversation.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you, Oprah. That's a very comprehensive answer, Professor Moosa. I can even see Mustafa Akyol raising his hand. You want to say something, Mustafa?
Yeah, sure. To add to what Dr. Moosa said, and I agree with him. I mean, and just two things. I myself am a bit more critical of the Ash'ari kalam in general. And I think I find the obsession on the persona of Ghazali misguided as well. And I think he was the most articulate voice within the Ash'ari tradition. Ibn Rushd actually uses to criticize him a little bit, to say he was with Ash'ari with the Ash'aris, he was philosopher with the philosophers. And Ghazali's condemnation of the philosophers was more pointed, but it was taken to a broader condemnation of philosophy by later people who maybe didn't get it full right. So yes, there's more nuance needed there. But just one more thing on the hadith issue. I mean, our friend Afsar Ali raised, like, do we have to take the hadiths as definitive? Why don't we focus on the Quran? And I agree with Ebrahim Moosa that hadith tradition, literature is there, and we have to come to terms with it. And Islam, which solely based on the Quran, although some people subscribe to that, the Quraniyun or the Quranists are there. I mean, it's a marginal point of view, but the tradition, it's there. And also you need the hadith tradition to understand what the Quran is talking about, because we need the context. However, I think also it is important to establish the idea that all hadiths might not be as authentic as they claim. Not every word in Sahih Bukhari might be unquestionably Sahih. For example, there's no hadith on blasphemy, but there are 2 hadiths on apostasy. I mean, whomever leaves his religion, kill him. That's in Sahih Bukhari. That's the basis of the apostasy law. And we can question, I mean, it's not quoted in the early discussions about Islam when it comes to the issue of apostasy. They appear at a time just a little bit surprisingly late. I mean, we start to hear about it and then they appear. So hadith literature is there and we have to come to terms with it. But it is important to bring in the idea that something might have been written in Sahih al-Bukhari or Sahih al-Muslim as Sahih, but this is human collecting and human effort, and those scholars did their best, but maybe it was something put into circulation for a political agenda, for some bias. So I just would like to emphasize that. I think we can't get rid of the hadith tradition, but a discussion on the sanctity and the unquestionability of the Sahih literature is, I think, important. And there are people who will say, if you deny one hadith from Sahih Bukhari, you'll be kafir. So that is a problem, I think.
And
Can
also,
I just nuance? Can I just nuance that phrase?
Yes, go ahead.
2 things. I agree with Mustafa. You know, one of the ways in which, you know, people who have not fully equipped with the complexity of tradition, one way that people got away with that, and some Salafis also to that, was on the question of isnad, and then, you know, eliminate hadith, and, you know, and just wish away hadith. What's the name? Oftentimes, historically, in the tradition, in the complex Muslim tradition, so there's a simplistic Muslim tradition, what I would call today a simplex Muslim tradition, that many people just find it very convenient to use, and, you know, can silence the opposition and silence fellow Muslims and so on. That's a simplex tradition. There's also the complex tradition. In the complex Muslim tradition, Muslims always followed interpretation. Interpretation and ta'wil was our biggest resource. Interpretation was critical. But interpretation means that the whole world is in front of you. All the knowledge of the world is in front of you. And then individuals and communities arrive at notions of interpretation. People talk about Ibn Taymiyyah. Of course, Ibn Taymiyyah has many things. Ibn Taymiyyah is also the most misunderstood person. Give an example. There's clear hadith that say that a Muslim shall not inherit from a non-Muslim, and a non-Muslim shall not inherit from a Muslim. Clear hadith. No one questioned that. All the law schools, Sunni and Shia, subscribe to that. In Egypt, Ibn Taymiyyah is faced with, he spent time in Syria and Egypt. Ibn Taymiyyah knows this hadith. Many Copts do not want to convert to Islam because they have very wealthy fathers and mothers. And if they convert, they will be denied inheritance. Ibn Taymiyyah says, conversion to Islam is a much more higher goal. They can convert and they can also inherit. He was prepared to put aside those hadith that are explicit because of the greater public interest of a community who want to achieve faith, and that these questions of inheritance and family matters and rules and regulations are, in his view, at that instance, secondary. On other instances, Ibn Taymiyyah is going to fight with you on that. Similarly, on these hadith that we have on variety of topics, including blasphemy and apostasy, it could have meant something in the past, but today that interpretation in today's context will result in a different interpretation. You don't have to deny the hadith its existence. You also don't have to attack its credence if its credence is not even open and sustainable to a. What we need to do is interpretation. And one of the greatest things that the Quran talks about is that Joseph was given the capacity of ta'wilul ahadith, the interpretations of events. We are not people who interpret statements. We are people, our community are people who interpret events, world events. And these are people who should show restraint One of the big issues that the Quran teaches us is Ibrahim alayhi salam was the person, the Prophet Abraham was a person of restraint. He was Halim. This idea of Hilm, to show restraint, is a primary concept in Islamic thought, in Islamic ethics, that you must show restraint. That restraint must be in interpretation, that restraint must be in your utterances, that restraint must be in your conduct. So I think interpretation without ethics, without these issues. Secondly, every interpretation comes with a package of history and political theology. What Ahmed Kuru was trying to point out is that in various times, there are the kind of state, people collaborate with the state, and the ulama in the state, but there's also ulama outside the state. So this question is not a one-way street. As many ulama who were collaborating with the state and working with the state and became qadis and so on and so forth at various Islamic empires, there were also similar amount of people outside the state criticizing the state. So it's a very robust thing. And the big question of the political theological is that every kind of the ordering of the world involves some kinds of theological presuppositions. The theological presuppositions of Western democracy, according to some interpretations, is this idea of freedom and the idea of freedom of speech. That is a political theological, that's a secular political theological. Muslim empires had different kinds of political theological. The major political theological element in the imperial system was obedience. Obedience, but these were not liberal societies. These were societies where the idea of liberalism or liberty was very different from what we understand it today. So we cannot then project modern liberty on 7th century Arabia, on Ottoman Turkey, or on Umayyad or Abbasid societies. Idea of liberty is a very modern idea. What they thought about liberty there is a free person versus a slave. And that free person had to give obedience to the state. So it was a culture of obedience. And that is not only Muslim cultures, was also Western cultures. They had to give obedience to the king. Therefore, if you don't obey the king, it could be a capital offense. So I think that we need to think through these issues, that these are political, theological questions, always mesh with the interpretations, and there's no way that you can get out of it. You're always in that mess. And lastly, people think that, Muslim empires adopted modernity, and all those people that adopted modernity are all sellouts and so on and so forth. Not true. One of the reasons why the Ottomans were never subject to colonization, but they became very quickly knowledgeable about the traditions of the West and the knowledge tradition, especially technology, because they need to have better armies in order to defend themselves against various kinds of threats. Otherwise, they would have no territory and terrain. The Mughals came late to that game. Before the Mughals came to realize what was going on, Clive was already in Delhi, and they conquered India through Bengal. They didn't have technological advancement in terms of military capacity to defend. So, these issues are much more complex, and history is not made by simplistic interpretations and so on. And I just gave you one snippet of it. It's a much more complicated story of why civilizations rise and fall. And Ahmed Kuru and I will have a more robust conversation in future.
Yeah, in fact, what you are basically saying, Professor Moosa, is that you're making a case against the idea of absolutism, which was in the context of France and the French Revolution, was represented by King Louis XIV in the 17th century, who claimed that, I am the state. So basically, this is what the ulama too have. That's the case of Ahmad too. The lines between the state and the ulama got blurred. They were kind of moving across that line. So that's what basically we need to grapple with and discuss further. Maybe I think that's the subject of another much more detailed conversation. So I think now I would like to give an opportunity.
Can I
Ahmed,
have a very quick? Yeah, very
please,
quickly.
Ahmed, yeah, please go ahead. You've been very patient.
I didn't want to discuss the interpretation, but since both Ibrahim and Mustafa rightly point to this issue, first of all, the hadith Mustafa rightly refers to is the basis of all the debates. Whomever leaves his religion, kill him. So the ulama and many others take everything literal, right? Literally, if we follow this hadith, we have to kill all Christians becoming Muslim, all pagans becoming Muslim, because whomever change religion, kill him. It doesn't say whomever leave Islam, kill him. So literally. Second, the issue of ulama state alliance. Quran doesn't have anything about politics, but there is this verse, including the statement, ulul amri minkum. It has been interpreted, reinterpreted in various ways. But then Ibn Taymiyyah, in his book about Sharia-based governance, and we only have two books on Islam, Sharia, Caliphate. One is Mawardi, 11th century, the other Ibn Taymiyyah, early 14th century. And he says, Ulul Amri Minkum means Umara and Ulama. Umara, state authorities, Ulama, alim, scholars. So, but where do they get the power, authority of monopolizing interpretation on that hadith of killing those leaving religion, or ulul amri minkum? Because they said they have the ijma. But what is the point of ijma? It says, my community does not agree upon error, says the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But this hadith is very emancipatory. This hadith refers to majority opinion, democracy, perhaps you can deduce. This hadith refers to community. It doesn't refer to ulama, but ulama hijacked the whole notion of Muslim community. There is no position in Sunni Islam authorize a group of clergy. Isn't it the difference between Sunni and Shia? And Ibn Khaldun in Muqaddimah says that many Shia ideas becoming Sunnis, and Sunni is not aware of it. And I am not here to criticize Shia, I respect, but I disagree that there is a clergy. In Sunni Islam, in theory, there is no clergy. In Sunni Islam, in theory, there is no waiting person, Mahdi, Messiah, Mujaddid, etc. But Sunnis somehow, this is Ibn Khaldun's ideas elaborated in Muqaddimah, really follow these ideas through tasawwuf, through Sufism, certain hierarchy. And today, if you ask Sunni ulama, are we like Catholics, clergy versus laymen? The ulama say, no, we are different. There is no ruhban in Islam. There is no layman clergy in Islam. Then who are you? Who gives you the authority to define and make the interpretation? They say ijma. What is the source of ijma? The hadith. But the hadith says community. It doesn't say community of scholars. So my point in a nutshell, that as Ebrahim also mentioned, that until the 11th century, the class of ulama was very weak, not clearly defined, identified. Many Islamic scholars have occupations. Abu Hanifa was a silk merchant. Ahmed ibn Hanbal worked in a textile industry. We have numerical data today from 8th to mid-11th century. Out of 3,900 Islamic scholars, 91% were working in private sector. Only 9% were working in the court system, in the state bureaucracy, like the student of Imam Abu Hanifa, Imam Yusuf, etc. 9% minority. 90, when I look at all the professions they had, some were barber, they have barber shops. Some were porters carrying items manually. Some were merchants, many were merchants. So, but in the 11th century, things change. After the 11th century, the Seljuks, the Mamluks, the Ottomans, they destroyed the monetary economy, made a semi-feudal system of iqta, timar system on land revenue distribution, military state control economy, and they also made the ulama state servants. And ulama somehow joined this partnership, willingly or unwillingly. But the result today is that despite all the claim of Sunni ulama that there is no clergy, no ruhban in Islam, Sunni Islam, there is. And they don't let people like us, intellectuals, professors, talk about Islam. They say, who are you? You are not ulama. But in Sunni Islam, we are all equal. Everyone, anyone can interpret religions. Therefore, the hadith about killing those who leave religion, The ayah in the Quran, ulul amri minkum, these are all open to interpretation, and we really need new interpretation on all of them. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ahmed. I think Mustafa wanted to leave. Mustafa, can you hear me? Because I couldn't message you on the phone. The phone is being
I
used
have
here.
to leave in 10 minutes maximum. So if
Yeah,
there's
sure.
a specific question for me, I'll get that, then I'll have to.
Yeah, fine, no problem.
Yeah.
So if anybody has a question for Mustafa, they can ask. But I'd like to give an opportunity to a non-Muslim brother here, or a sister perhaps, Indra Munshi. Maybe if he or she could unmute and ask, a question, maybe it'd be fine. Yes, please.
Faiz, I will also have to go in a couple of minutes. I
Couple of minutes. Okay. Okay. Yeah.
Yes,
Am I
please.
audible?
Yeah, you're audible. Can you please introduce yourself and ask your question?
I will. I really don't have a question, but okay. I am
I saw your
Indra
hand raised.
Munshi, a sociologist. I'm speaking from.
You're speaking
Sorry,
from? You're speaking from?
I'm speaking from Bombay,
Okay.
India.
Okay. Okay.
I am a sociologist. I was a professor of sociology.
Okay.
However, I have found the entire discussion extremely illuminating and answered a whole lot of things which have been troubling and bothering so many of us, for which we want some kind of clear, rational thinking. I just want to ask maybe an open comment question. In the contemporary context, and in the final analysis, if we want democracy, or if we value democratic norms and some kind of egalitarianism, then isn't it a crucial factor to be allowed to think and speak?
Yeah, we can't hear you. I think we have lost you. Yeah.
I mean, what I heard was that Professor Munshi was saying that shouldn't be, for democracy to thrive, shouldn't people be allowed to speak? My view is yes, people should be allowed to speak, and we should develop resources and opportunities for people to speak, and also to speak intelligently. And even for people that we disagree with, we must have a code of conduct of how we disagree. We cannot disagree, and the first thing that comes out of our mouth with anybody disagree, we call them, that is anathema, that is takfir, and so on and so forth. There must be an etiquette of conversation and so on. Unfortunately, very prevalent in Muslim societies. I see Ulul Abshar Abdullah, my good friend from Indonesia there, myself, Mustafa Akyol, Ahmed Kuru, and many of us who speak about these issues, write about the issues. The first thing that happens in our communities, leave alone outside communities, the first thing that they say that, you can't say this, and this is kufr, or this is violating Islam. And therefore, it is so critical that we have these conversations, but we can also disagree robustly and lovingly and caringly. We should be able to disagree with each other in a loving, caring manner and hold our positions and try to persuade each other. If we cannot persuade each other, then how can we have democratic formation? So I think that's what I thought Professor Munshi was asking.
Yeah. Okay, Habib Sab, he's been waiting for some time. Can you go ahead and ask your question, please? Habib
Yeah,
Hussain,
I have. I'm from Chennai in India, and I have a question. Any one of the three panelists, maybe for all three, religion and the state. When you say state, I mean the Constitution. What is our stand on that? Religion and state. I think in every democracy where there is a mixed communities, mixed faiths, we have a problem where we are pretending to be one thing, and when we go into our communities, we are another. And I travel all over the world. Half the time in the West and half the time in India and the Far East, I see we are in communities which are, you know, closed communities. We have our own ghettos. And, you know, the other thing is, even in this discussion, I mean, the three of you, it was so illuminating. I learned so much. But we are talking about instances in history and based on that for the last 1,500 years. Whereas now, you know, the principles of virtue, ethics, good, bad, simple Boy Scout things, you know, and there are the topics which from the Vedas and all which predate thousands of years. So nobody wants to know our point of view. 95% of the world doesn't even want to know our point of view. And we have, the ground is slipping from under our feet. And I head communities here. And what I find is I am either with them, my own people, or with I'm away from them. They say the youth are, and there's joblessness, there's unemployment, there's hostility growing. And in that, we are looking at very fine points. We are going into very, very fine things. How do we just get good and bad in and make our faith more inclusive rather than, you know, it is exclusive today, in my opinion. Thank you.
So who would like to take
Maybe
that?
I can, yeah, maybe I can take very briefly religion and
Yeah.
state. So we all know Samuel Huntington and Bernard Lewis. And after Edward Said's book, Orientalism became a well-known term. And the main critique of these Orientalists, especially Bernard Lewis, is that Islam is unique. There is no separation between church and state. And Huntington extended with the cliche that the following quote from Huntington: in Islam, God is Caesar. In China, Caesar is God. In Orthodox Christianity, God is Caesar's junior partner. The separation and constant clash between church and state only exists in Western Christianity. So Muslims generally are very critical of Lewis, or say Islamists, but they have 100% agreement with him, saying that, of course, Islam is different from Christianity. Of course, there's no separation of religion and state in Islam. But why aren't Islamists questioning this cliche of Orientalists that there's no separation? Very briefly, I want to mention that in my book, I try to show that in early Islamic history, from the 8th to mid-11th century, there was certain level of separation between Islam and state because of the Jamal, Siffin, and then the Umayyad persecution of Prophet's family. There was a disenchantment. Shias clearly and definitely declare Umayyad as illegitimate, but even Sunni scholars regarded Umayyads and certain Abbasi caliphs, with only exception of Umar bin Abdulaziz, as religiously not legitimate, politically only legitimate. And Umayyads themselves regard themselves secular kings. Although they declare caliphate, etc., look at their palaces with nude photos, not photos, but paintings in their Umayyad palaces, etc. They brought the idea of raison d'etat, the purpose of state, paramount for Umayyads. That's how they defeated Ali and Hassan and Hussein. So therefore, Muslims really need to question the whole misleading idea that there is no separation between religion and state. This is an Orientalist view. This is a post-11th century ulama view. Ibn Taymiyyah and others impose it to us. We have to separate religion, politics, art, academia, sports, all the spheres to a certain extent. I don't mean an absolute separation, but I mean autonomy, independence, because if one sphere dominates the other, we call it corruption. Today, what is the problem in Trump's administration? President Trump used political power, interferes to economics, interferes to religion, interferes to every sphere, and we all criticize and making fun of him. But if this is Islamic theory of combining everything, politics, religion, arts, academia, philosophy, the result is injustice. The result is corruption. The result is inefficiency. Therefore, we have to separate every sphere with its own criteria. Every sphere, let me explain in Islamic terminology. Esma Husna, God's beautiful names, are multiple, and every sphere of life is in the zill of, in the shadow of some Esma Husna, has its own autonomy. As an intellectual academic myself, I do not accept any authority above me, no political authority, no religious authority. At the point I accept any authority, I lose my critical mind. I lose my ability to write and write from a fair perspective, and this is the problem, I think, in the Muslim world. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we have come to the end of our discussion, because we said 90 minutes and we have actually exceeded 2 hours now. And I think Mustafa also has to leave. And shall we just take any one last question, if it's okay with these speakers, because there are some hands raised. Is it okay?
I wanted to make some Faiz.
Yes, and Zafrullah, do you have any comment to make or question to ask? Yeah, because I don't, sometimes I miss you when you raise your hand. So I just, if you have anything, maybe you can unmute and ask after.
No, not
Dr.
now.
Okay, fine. Fine. Professor
I
Moosa,
have a
please go ahead.
question. Excuse me.
You pardon me? Who's this?
Shiba from Delhi.
Yes, Shiba. I think Professor Moosa wanted to say something. Maybe after that, perhaps.
Okay.
No, no. I was reminding you that Professor Akyol wanted to say something, and then
Yes,
I can say
yeah.
something after.
Yeah, Mustafa, you wanted to say something. Go ahead if you have to say something.
I apologize. I will have to leave in 2 minutes, but
Okay.
then because of that, I wanted to say something on what we
Yes.
discussed so far.
Yes, please
If
go
you
ahead.
direct a question to me right after that, I can quickly take that too, but I really have to leave.
Yeah, your voice is a little feeble. Maybe you have to adjust your mic or something.
So should I make a comment now?
Yeah, please go ahead. Please go ahead. But just can you adjust your mic? I mean, your voice is a bit feeble.
Okay.
We can't.
Okay. Dr. Moosa made a good point that the values we're discussing today, like freedom of speech, liberty, they did not exist 500 years ago. It is true. And the Christian world didn't have these values either. I mean, they were killing people for apostasy and blasphemy more rigorously than Muslims, you know, like, until the modern era. But the point is, Christianity doesn't burn people at the stake anymore. They don't kill their apostates or blasphemers. Thank God, that's why people from Christianity can convert into Islam, and they're not killed by their core religions for that. I mean, they had a rethinking of their tradition, which was helpful. There are, of course, a lot of still fanatic ideas here and there, but it's not the same thing in medieval Christianity. Now, can we make this switch? And yes, there was no democracy 500 years ago, nowhere. But now there's something called democracy. Is this a good idea? Is it kufr, or is this something we can expect? So this change in world history is, I think, important. And I think Faizur Rahman, a great thinker from the subcontinent, he was critical of Muslims for not fully understanding this historical change in world history. Now, one obstacle is when you religionize everything in your religious history. Oh, there should be a caliph and we should all be obedient to him and all that, and as Al-Mawrid wrote. Well, Al-Mawrid wrote and thought as a 10th, 11th person who was living in that age. None of the classical Islamic scholars questioned slavery. For all of them, it was normal. It was normal in the whole world until 2 centuries ago. And it was not easy to abolish slavery. When the idea of abolishing slavery came, some of the ulama said, in some Deobandis in the subcontinent and others elsewhere, and Wahhabis for sure, they said, no, it's haram, it's right there in our Sharia, and so on and so forth. But then Muslims came to the, most of them at least, the majority of them. Yes, there was slavery at the beginning of Islam, but it was not what Islam brought. Islam just regulated it, and the intention was to abolish it. So they took this kind of progressive interpretation, if you will. But if we did this on slavery, we can do this on freedom of speech or freedom of religion. And I think this is partly in the solution lies in understanding the value of these concepts, then also having an understanding of religion that is more contextual and historical. There was polygamy widespread. It was necessary actually in 7th century Arabia when men were killing each other and there were more women than men all the time. It was a social condition. Now the world is in a different, so can we make that transition is I think the key point here. So that's all I wanted to say on these issues.
Yes, thanks. Thank you, Mustafa. I think I can't hold you. If anybody wants to ask a question, that will be to Ahmet Kuru, because I think he's going to be here for a few more minutes. Professor Moosa and Professor Mustafa Akyol, I think, may want to leave now. So I think they have been with us for a long time, more than 2 hours now. It's almost two and a quarter hours. Thank you very much, Professor Moosa and Mustafa, for being here.
Brother Faiz, I can take the answer from, I got a couple of minutes, the answer from
fine,
the last
great.
question, and I'll go, and I'll make my closing comments.
Okay, I think if Mustafa wants to leave, perhaps I think we should let him go, right? Mustafa, I mean, you want to stay for some time?
Something else is going on, but thank you so much for this, and it's a pleasure to hear Dr. Moosa and Ahmet, and also all the friends and colleagues here. Again, one final thought: the main issue for us is whether we can stop using coercive power for the benefit of religion. That is about apostasy, that's about blasphemy, that's about punishing people for not wearing a hijab. And when we are coerced, we react to that against. I mean, the French ban on hijab is absolutely unacceptable, right? I mean, in public spaces. But can we accept the idea that religion is just nasiha, you know, as a good hadith in Sahih Bukhari says, it's advice, but it's not something to be coerced. And that includes how people speak, that includes how people believe. And I think if we take that step, we will be more at peace with ourselves and our societies, and there will be less, you know, negative opinion about Islam in the world. And for that, we need to be able to speak about these things. So the first step is to even being able to speak.
Yes.
Thank you again. Apologies that I have to leave a little bit early, but I'm happy that we
must thank you. I mean, you have spent more than 2 hours with us, Mustafa. It's so kind of you. It's a Sunday morning and you were.
But we believe in, just some family thing going on.
Okay.
Inshallah, next time again we will speak. Thank you for all. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you. Wa alaikum salam, Mustafa. And Shiba, you want to ask something to Professor Moosa or Ahmet Kuru? You can go ahead.
I had a very small query, very specific to our conditions in India. The question is that in a multicultural society, what is the extent of accepting, respecting, maybe following marriage in other creeds? So, to what extent we may look forward to other faith traditions in making our lives more meaningful?
Looking at other faith traditions to do what? I didn't understand. Hear the question properly.
Yeah, respecting, accepting the merits in other faith traditions.
The merits.
The merits. Yeah, merits. And goodness,
yes.
Goodness and merits in other faith traditions.
Very good. Thank you. Got it. So I'm going to just latch on to some of the comments that I think it was Brother Habib from Chennai who asked this question about, you know, the place of the political and what is the role of religion in the multicultural society and so on. I think these are the issues of the day and the time. And even where there are Muslim majorities, Turkey, Indonesia, and other places, Muslims are themselves internally different. They are internally different, economically, politically, and otherwise different. And how to deal with those differences are the major challenges of our time. One of the key issues that I think Muslim intellectuals have yet not addressed is the question of what I call that we have inherited a political theology of empire. The political theology of empire. A best example for you would be that when the overthrow of the Morsi government happened in Turkey, in Egypt, there was a debate between two major religious scholars. Now, just to remind you, the Egyptians in that 18 months, they wrote a constitution, they had the rules of the game, they had elections, right? They had the interim, all this kind of stuff. They had the rules of the game and so on. When Morsi was overthrown by Sisi, a debate occurred, not directly, but indirectly, between two important figures. One was Yusuf Qaradawi, who is a leading Egyptian who sits who lives in Qatar. and he's a supporter of Mursi. And the other one is Ali Juma, who was very reluctant for revolution and the revolution that overthrew Mubarak. In the last minute, he sided with the protesters or whatever. He did not stop objecting. He was also the chief mufti of the state mufti of Egypt for some time. And when Sisi overthrew Mursi, he made a public statement. So remember, these people were talking, they are dealing with the democratic electoral system, with the constitution and rules of the game. The answer that these two people told were very telling where the leading religious intelligentsia are of the Muslim world. Ali Juma said that a imam, he used the word imam. Last time I checked, Mursi is not an imam. He's not a theological religious leader, a political leader. He's a democratically elected religious leader. But look at the language that Ali Juma uses. Al-imam al-ma'zul la shar'iyyata lahu. That a deposed imam doesn't have, a deposed religious political leader does not have any legitimacy. And hence Mursi is gone. You have a new legitimated authority, which is with the coup, and his name is Sisi. Out in Qatar, Qaradawi says that Sisi is a rebel. According to classical Islamic theology, he is a rebel and he should be removed. A rebel should be dealt with, militarily. What is going on here? That we're living in the 21st century of democratic rules of the game, but our leading intellectuals, religious intellectuals, are talking from a playbook of 11th and 12th century political theology. And that political theology is embedded in a variety of actions and practices, from your understanding of zakat, from your practices of Jummah, from your questions about whether Islam, religion and state should be together or not. All those things, these things have not been thought about, have not been critiqued, have not been subjected to a new investigation, like the blasphemy question, like the apostasy question. All these issues are linked to political theological, and more so also to economic issues. The way societies in the past were organized economically and politically, religion was part of the mix, and these things all came together. We have gone through a transformation. Now, the big question that many Muslims face is, are they prepared to accept the separation between religion and politics? For most of the 20th century, the Muslim public discourse amongst those who had the bullhorns and those who had the public ear, political Islam, basically said, no, it must be together. The Iranian Revolution said, no, we're going to combine religion and politics. Okay. In Pakistan, they kept on religionizing the state. And the voices that talked for separation, or that it can be, or the kind of interpretation that Ahmed gives and so on and so forth, I mean, might not have been there from day one. It could have been very different in the empires and so on and so forth, but there could be a different narrative that Muslims can arrive at. Nothing in my view is not subject to alteration and reinterpretation. That's my bottom line. But what one needs to have coherent conversations about those issues. And those of us who want to jump into those conversations, lay people as well as intellectuals, we might need to want to do our homework better in order to sustain a position that we want to argue for. The question that Mr. Habib said and so on, we're talking about history, we're talking about, absolutely, if a people without history is going to be lost. One of the biggest challenges that Muslims face, that Muslims are ignorant of the history, or we have this kind of, we have the version of history that most of us walk around with is, Muslim history for dummies. That's the version of history that we walk around with. And we have this quick interpretation of what went wrong, what went right, who's to blame, who's not to blame. That is not history. That is history for dummies. And I think what we need to do is to have a much more complex. First thing is that we need to invest in institutions. Mr. Habib, you would do well if you invest in institutions in Chennai that's going to create opportunities for universities and colleges to study Muslim history, to study world history, not only Muslim history, world history, to understand history complexly. A people without culture is a people that is doomed for extinction. And that culture is important. Muslims are rich in culture. From your Urdu poetry, from your Hindi poetry, from the Arabic poetry, from your Turkish poetry, these are rich. Indonesia is rich with culture. But if you're not going to study your culture, if you're not going to value your culture, then you're going to make the verses of the Quran that were based on a complex culture, you're going to ask that verse to give you all the answers. You're going to ask that solitary hadith to give you all the answers. And I can guarantee you that you're going to fail, or if you're going to come up with versions, it's not going to look very different from the ISIS version or the Al-Qaeda version that cuts off people's heads or destroys themselves and others. So what I'm saying is, what I'm appealing to here is that we have to be patient and we need to have human development. This issue cannot be solved by 3 people giving an opinion on a webinar or on a conversation and think it's going to sell. What we need to do is they need to have human development in Muslim societies so that the minds and souls can be what's in. What we are trying to do here is to insert a conversation and asking people that we haven't given the last word, but this is the beginning of a conversation, and you need to sustain these conversations wherever you are. And you need to sustain this conversation in a complex way, not in a simplex way. And I know people don't have patience because people tell me Islam is simple. You academics and religious scholars make it difficult. No, Islam is not simple. If you think Islam is your salvation, then it cannot be a simple issue. It's a complex issue. You have to struggle with it every day. You have to go through these various issues. So my bottom line is we need to be people who study our history and world history much more complexly. We need to think very seriously about the political theology of empire that is still very much embedded in our very many kinds of our thinking, from our thinking in fiqh, from our thinking in theology, from our thinking in politics. We need to revisit those issues. And then we need to also begin to say that what is the value of the present and how do we take the present seriously? Most of us, many of modern Muslims and young Muslims have a basically schizophrenic relationship with the modern. We hate the modern, but we use it all the time. Or the nation state. Everybody wants to run to America and Europe to have a better life out there, but they can't deal with democracy in India. Or they don't want to create a flourishing democracy in Pakistan or in Bangladesh or in Indonesia or those kinds of places. It takes work. In these societies in the West, they spent trillions of dollars in education and building foundations so that people can remember where they came from. Let me give you my concluding remark is that in every small college or university in America, where there's a 2nd or 3rd grade rate university, there are departments of classics and departments of history. And there they study Roman history, Greek history, so that people know where their democracy comes from. Yes, it might look very surprising that all those crazy people that follow Trump, that they don't know that. And yeah, there are also many know-nothings in this country. There are many know-nothings in this country too, in America, where I'm seated right now. But there are also many educated and informed people that can make decisions and people that in the past built the foundations of these countries so that they could be successful. These are not perfect societies. These are not perfect politics and so on, but they have something, they develop something. That took effort, that takes labor, that takes investment in human resources and human development. You cannot subject a person who has no dignity and a deficit of dignity and tell that person you need to show restraint when that person doesn't have a clue what restraint is, when the person is fighting for their existence every minute, or they see that the propaganda that people of other faiths tell them or other faiths insult them, how they deal with that issue. So I'm not saying that it is justifiable. What we need to create is optimize the conditions that Ahmed writes in his book, how we make it possible for human flourishing to take place. He and I can disagree about the narrative that he has of how we got here, that we can disagree, but we cannot disagree with his conclusion that you need to have human development. And if you're not going to have human development, you are going to fail as societies and as individuals. And that is the critical issue. He's trying to make, and I'm trying to, and a variety of us are trying to make you understand that why human development is so critical, why you need to take care of those youngsters in your community, educate them properly, make sure that they are exposed to the varieties of not only Islamic education, but they must be exposed to world education. And that question that the last question asked me is that, how do you, of course, when you study Hinduism, when you study Buddhism, when you study Christianity and Judaism, you're going to see the wisdom in those traditions. But if you have to be taught, and if you are taught that in Islam, Muslims have the statement, whether it's a hadith or a statement, but a beautiful statement, that wisdom is the lost treasure of the believer. Wherever he or she finds it, they are the most deserving of it. We need to take that seriously. That is not only wisdom that is written in Arabic or Urdu or Persian or Turkish that is wisdom that is valuable. Wisdom in all forms is valuable. And Muslims must develop that ability to grapple with that. So there are no quick fixes to this question. The quick fix is the long fix. That is building, flourishing societies where human dignity prevails, and we need to rein in ignorance in the religion, or religion that masquerades as, ignorance that masquerades as religion. That needs to be stopped, and that requires a conversation, and a difficult conversation. But I wish you all well with that. Thank you. These are my closing remarks.
Yeah, I think that beautifully put, Professor Moosa. I mean, I really enjoyed listening to you on this, even though I just went briefly out. Would you like to add anything to that, Ahmed? Or shall we ask another question if you have the time?
No, I'm thankful to Ibrahim for his comments, and we can get questions from Uli Abdullah or other friends. And I have a few more minutes if there are questions. Otherwise, we can conclude. Yeah.
Any other question? Who? I mean, I can see some raised hands. Rashid Mutala, I can see. Can you go ahead, Rashid?
Sorry, my question is a technical one. Whoever advertised this program to me, I joined 1 hour late. So how do I access the beginning? Because I see it being recorded. Yeah, it's being recorded. Yes, of course. We will. So how will I access it? Yeah, if you can type in your email ID in the chat box, we will send you the chat box is closed at the moment. I cannot access it.
Closed. I think. Can you please activate it?
Faiz, before I go, also many people on Facebook and others said that they wanted to watch this, they couldn't watch them. So you might post it on the link on your Facebook, Faiz.
Yes, of course,
on your organization's website. Okay.
Yes, of course.
Thank you very much, Faiz, and thank you very much for my colleagues who all joined. I really appreciate this conversation, Faiz. Keep on with the good work, and keep on spreading the complex literacy that we need so much.
Okay? And when's your trip to Chennai, Professor Moosa? You had plans to come here.
Well, right? First you need to get rid of the virus.
Yes,
then of course. Once I have some immunity against that, I will happily come. Okay.
Absolutely.
Take care.
Inshallah. Thank you so much being there. So, all questions directed to Ahmed now.
We already,
Yeah, I think somebody wanted to ask
2 hours. Yeah.
Yes, Ahmed, just let us know how long you are willing to be here. Another 5 minutes, 10 minutes.
Maybe it's time to conclude.
Okay.
Yeah, do take pity on Ahmed. He's been up since 5 o'clock, if not before.
That's true. I'm so sorry.
I'm waiting to get my hands on Ahmed's book.
Oh, thank you. You're very kind.
And shall we take just one last question before we end?
Okay, just one. Yeah.
Because since we had already announced the name of Rashid Mutala, so we are thinking in all fairness.
I think, Uli Abdullah left. I think Dr. Iftikhar Malik. Yeah, who else? Yeah, go ahead to take the question, then I'll make
This is the last question. Comments. Yes, please.
Yes, great.
No, we mentioned Rashid Mutala. If you're not asking, then the next question perhaps. Rashid.
No, my question was a technical one, and you answered already.
Oh, you answered. Fine. I think that was you. Great. Go ahead. Who was the one who asked us now? Bilal.
My name is Bilal.
Yeah. Can you introduce yourself first, please? And...
Yes. I am from.
We can't hear you at all. You'll have to adjust your mic.
I am from.
We can't hear you at all. No, I think we still can't hear you. No, we can't hear you. I'm sorry. Shall we take? I mean, does anybody else would like to ask? Is anyone else who would like to ask? And then we can. Yeah.
Sorry, may I suggest that the sister who can't be heard type her question in?
Yeah, she can type it on the chat box. Yes, yes. Why not?
So Faizur, my chat is open. If there's a question, I'll read it. Otherwise, let me conclude because it's already 2.5 hours past.
Yeah, I think we should conclude. We don't have time.
Yeah, good. Thank you. So.
Okay. Okay. I think you should conclude now, Ahmed. Would you like to make any concluding remarks before you leave? Or?
Many thanks for all. Yeah, many thanks for all of us waiting so long. I think it's a very good idea to post the video that others can watch.
Yes.
I try to put this question of blasphemy and apostasy in a broader context of Muslim intellectual stagnation.
Yes.
And we should never forget that between 8th to 12th century, Muslims had a brilliant civilization with certain level of separation between religion and state, very dynamic intellectual and bourgeois classes. But later on, after mid-11th century, ulama-state alliance marginalized both the intellectuals and the bourgeois. So right now, in many countries, including my home country, Turkey, there is the question of westernization. And many Muslims react saying that we want our own culture, we don't want to imitate the West. What I'm trying to emphasize is that Muslims do not need to imitate the West. They already have their own history from 8th to 12th century, a history of intellectual dynamism, a history of economic innovation, a history of diversity and multiple philosophical views. And that's what should inspire us. And that's the optimistic possibility of having a renaissance, going back to the roots, understand how early Islam had self-confidence. They learn from Greeks, they learn from India, they learn from Persia, they develop their own contributions and teach science and math and everything to Europe. I think with this optimistic note, I want to conclude.
Thank you.
And wish a blessing day to all of you.
Yes, but if anybody would like to continue, I mean, we can be here for some more time after Ahmed leaves. We can discuss among ourselves for another 5-10 minutes if you want. But I think we must let Ahmed go. He's been here since 5 a.m.
Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum.